Daniel had always been the kind of person who believed every trip needed excitement. He was friendly, talkative, and full of energy, but he also had a habit of treating serious places like casual tourist spots. Whenever he traveled, he liked to make jokes, tease his friends, and turn every moment into something funny. Most of the time, people around him laughed along, but sometimes he didn't understand when he needed to slow down and show respect. His trip to London was something he had been planning for months. He told everyone at home that he would visit all the famous places: Big Ben, the London Eye, Tower Bridge, and most importantly, Buckingham Palace. He had seen pictures of the royal guards online and watched videos of how they stand perfectly still. The idea fascinated him. To Daniel, it looked almost unreal, like statues dressed in bright uniforms. He couldn't imagine people staying so steady and calm for hours. So on his third day in London, when the weather was perfect and the streets were filled with excited tourists, he decided it was the right time to visit Buckingham Palace. He walked through the wide street leading to the palace, admiring the tall buildings and the large trees lining the path. His camera hung around his neck, and his phone was ready in his hand because he wanted to record everything. He liked creating funny clips for his social media, and this visit felt like a good opportunity. When he finally arrived near the palace gates, he stopped for a moment and stared. The palace was bigger than he expected, with clean white walls and shining golden details. The area was full of people from different countries. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, couples took photos together, and tour groups listened to guides explaining history. Everyone seemed cheerful and respectful, but what caught Daniel's attention most were the royal guards. He saw two of them standing tall and calm, dressed in deep red coats and tall black hats. Their posture was perfect. Their eyes did not move. Their hands held their rifles neatly at their sides. They looked exactly like the pictures he had seen online, but in person, they seemed even more impressive. Daniel walked closer, staying behind the line marked on the ground. He watched how people took photos politely, keeping a safe distance so the guards could do their work. Some tourists whispered to each other, amazed at how still the guards stood. There was a quiet sense of respect in the air, the kind of quiet that naturally happens in front of something important. But Daniel saw the moment differently. To him, the scene looked amusing. He whispered to himself, "Wow, they really do look like statues." He smiled, and an idea popped into his mind. He thought it would be funny to imitate the guard's posture. His friends back home would love it, he believed. So without thinking much, he pointed his camera at himself and began to mimic the guard's stiff stance. He placed his feet apart, puffed up his chest, held an imaginary rifle in his hand, and froze his face. A few tourists nearby noticed him and exchanged quiet smiles, unsure if they should laugh or feel awkward. Daniel didn't mind. Attention made the moment more exciting. After a few seconds, he broke his pose, laughed at himself, and watched the recording. "This is gold," he said under his breath. He wanted more. He wanted a clip that would get even more reactions. He took a step closer to the guard, not crossing the line but enough to feel bold, and began making exaggerated salutes. He raised his hand sharply, then repeated it in a silly manner. A couple standing nearby watched him with raised eyebrows. One of them gently told him, "You should be careful. They're working." Daniel brushed it off with a grin. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said lightly. "Just having a bit of fun." The truth was, he didn't mean any harm. He wasn't trying to upset anyone. He simply didn't understand the importance of the moment. To him, this was part of the trip, something to make his friends laugh later. More people began watching, even though they didn't know him. Some pulled out their phones expecting something surprising to happen because Daniel's behavior didn't match the respectful tone of the place. The crowd sensed that he wasn't taking things seriously. Many tourists felt uncomfortable, but no one wanted to cause a scene. Daniel kept going, changing his posture again. He stretched his legs, moved his arms around, and pretended he was one of the guards giving an important speech. He whispered dramatic lines, acted out fake motions, and laughed at his own jokes. People around him were now clearly unsure how to react. Some shook their heads. Others quietly stepped back. The guard remained still, focused on his duty, not reacting to anything Daniel was doing. His calm posture made Daniel even more curious. He wondered how someone could ignore everything happening around them so calmly. He didn't realize that this ability was part of their training and responsibility. A few children who were watching pointed at Daniel, giggling softly, not understanding the seriousness of what he was doing but reacting to his exaggerated movements. Their parents gently reminded them to stay quiet, teaching them to respect the guards. Daniel, however, wasn't paying attention to how the crowd was feeling. He looked at his recording again and felt proud of the clip. But a thought crossed his mind. Maybe he could make it even more dramatic. Maybe he could stand a bit closer for a better angle. He moved a step forward, ending up just inches away from the marked line. The people around him grew more alert. A woman whispered to her friend, "He shouldn't go any closer. They can give warnings." Another man cleared his throat and said quietly, "These guards serve real duties. This isn't a place for jokes." But Daniel didn't hear them. His excitement had taken over. He felt like he was in his own world, focused only on making the moment interesting. He held out his phone, positioned it for a new shot, and smiled widely at the camera. The atmosphere around him slowly changed. The respectful silence remained, but now there was a hint of tension. People could sense that Daniel's playful attitude was not matching the tone of the place. Even tourists who were just passing by paused to see what was happening. Daniel didn't intend to cause trouble. He had simply convinced himself that this was all harmless fun. He didn't think about rules, boundaries, or the meaning behind the guard's presence. He didn't realize he was standing in front of a national symbol of duty and tradition. For a moment, he felt like the center of attention, but not in a way he expected. Instead of laughter and applause, he received uncertain looks and soft warnings. Yet he still believed he could continue without crossing any serious limit. Daniel looked at the guard again, amazed at how steady he remained. A small part of Daniel admired the discipline, but another part felt challenged by it. He wanted to see if anything would make the guard react, not in a harmful way, but out of curiosity. And that curiosity pushed him to keep going. That was the moment when the quiet tension in the crowd reached its peak. People weren't sure what he would do next. They hoped he would step back and understand the seriousness of the area. But Daniel's playful nature didn't allow him to see the situation clearly. He took one last deep breath, adjusted his phone, and prepared himself for another silly action. Completely unaware that the moment he took that next step, everything around him would change. Daniel stood there with his phone raised, ready to take another recording. The quiet energy around Buckingham Palace felt different now, but he didn't realize it. He was lost inside his own excitement. The people around him were more alert, watching him more closely than before. Some were curious, others worried, and a few simply hoped he would calm down and enjoy the moment respectfully like everyone else. He looked at the guard again. The guard's posture didn't change at all. Still tall, still calm. Still completely focused on duty. This calmness should have been a sign to Daniel that he shouldn't push any further, but instead of understanding the seriousness of the moment, he felt encouraged. In his mind, the guard's quiet reaction meant he could be a little more playful and still be fine. So he took a small step to the side, pretending to give a dramatic announcement as if he were a tour guide. He moved his hands in big motions, pointing toward the guard with a wide grin. People around him watched with mixed feelings. Some gently shook their heads. A few smiled nervously, unsure whether it was okay to laugh. Most simply waited, hoping Daniel wouldn't make a mistake. One older man in a blue jacket, who had been watching from the beginning, leaned slightly toward Daniel and said softly, "You should be careful, young man. This is not a place for jokes." The voice was calm and polite, but Daniel brushed it off again. I know," he replied with a cheerful tone, even though he clearly did not understand. Daniel raised his phone higher and aimed the camera at the guard. He tried to match the guard's expression once again, making his face stiff and serious. It looked silly because he exaggerated everything. He thought the clip would be hilarious. He took a few steps backward, then forward again, still staying behind the line but pushing the limit. His movements became more dramatic, as if he were on stage performing for an audience. A group of teenagers nearby exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. One girl said, "He's going to get in trouble," and her friend nodded in agreement. Their voices were not loud enough for Daniel to hear, but many people around shared the same thought. Daniel then lifted his arm in a pretend salute, quick, large, and comical. A few tourists quietly sighed. Some parents gently pulled their children back, reminding them not to copy the behavior. It wasn't dangerous, but it felt inappropriate in such a respectful setting. At this point, Daniel felt excited instead of cautious. He was enjoying the attention, the recording, and the playful atmosphere he thought he was creating. He believed everything was harmless. He was not trying to be rude. He simply didn't understand how serious the situation could become if he continued. Then, as he checked his phone screen again, an idea popped into his head, an idea that made him smile widely. Maybe he could do a quick imitation of how the guard marched. He had seen videos of guards stepping in precise, careful motions, so he decided to copy it, but in a funny, exaggerated way. He lifted his leg high, stretched his arms out stiffly, and took a big step. He didn't go near the guard, but his movements were big enough to draw attention. The tourists around him reacted instantly. Some smiled because the motion looked funny, but their smiles faded quickly as they realized he was copying the guard's official movements. A few gasped softly, hoping he wouldn't take it any further. Daniel took another big step, swinging his arms awkwardly. He laughed at himself, thinking he was making the video even more entertaining. His phone continued recording everything. What he didn't notice was that more people had stopped to watch him now. Some watched out of curiosity, others out of concern. Behind him, a young mother whispered to her husband, "He should stop. This is not right." Her husband nodded with a concerned expression, but Daniel continued, still full of playful energy. He didn't understand how uneasy the crowd had become. Then something small but important happened. The guard's horse, which stood nearby, calm and still, shifted its legs slightly, feeling the energy around it change. The movement was natural and gentle, but the quiet sound of its hooves made Daniel stop for a split second. He looked over, surprised by the sudden motion. The horse's rider, another guard on duty, remained steady and quiet. His eyes did not follow Daniel, but his posture remained strong and focused. The presence of the horse, tall and majestic, made the area feel even more important. Most tourists knew to keep a respectful distance because horses can be easily distracted. Daniel didn't want to upset the horse. He wasn't trying to cause a problem. So he stepped back slightly, clearing the space. But instead of stopping, he turned the moment into part of his playful performance. "Oh, sorry, big friend," he said softly, waving at the horse with a friendly smile. Some tourists chuckled quietly at his gentle tone, but others still looked nervous. They understood the seriousness of the environment better than he did. Daniel then decided to record a new clip. He changed his position and held the phone to capture both himself and the guard in the background. He began speaking to the camera with excitement. "Here I am, everybody, Buckingham Palace, and behind me is the super strong royal guard who doesn't move at all. Look at this. So cool." His voice was light, cheerful, and not harmful. But again, he failed to understand the importance of where he stood. As he continued recording, he leaned slightly forward, closer to the line than before. His foot almost touched it. The tourists around him held their breath for a moment. No one shouted at him, but their concern grew. A woman with a map in her hand took a small step toward Daniel, as if she wanted to warn him gently, but she stopped herself. She didn't want to interrupt or draw attention. Daniel didn't realize any of this. He was focused on his video. "And now," he said, smiling, "I'm going to test something. I'm going to see if I can stand as still as him." He turned toward the guard again and stiffened his body. He placed his feet apart, raised his chin, and tried to freeze completely. He didn't look very serious, but he tried his best. The crowd watched. Some people quietly admired his creativity, but others wished he understood that this wasn't a place for such behavior. He stood still for a few seconds, then suddenly wiggled his eyebrows and broke into laughter. "I can't do it, no way," he said, shaking his head dramatically. A few tourists smiled politely. Daniel wiped an imaginary tear from his eye, pretending to cry from laughing so hard. It was silly, but he enjoyed performing. He lowered his phone and reviewed the recording again. He smiled widely as he watched himself on the screen. "This is going to go viral," he whispered to himself. That thought encouraged him even more. He then turned around to face the guard again, stepping just a little closer to the boundary. He didn't cross it. But he stood right at the edge, close enough to make people around him nervous. He lifted his hand and gave another over-the-top salute, this time with a playful wink. It was at that exact moment that the guard, who had remained completely still for so long, suddenly shifted his position. His foot moved sharply but gracefully into place, adjusting the stance. The motion was controlled and practiced, but it caught Daniel off guard. Daniel froze for a second. The unexpected movement surprised him. The crowd around him also reacted quietly, some stepping back, some whispering. But instead of understanding the warning or stepping away, Daniel misread the moment. He smiled again. "That was so cool," he whispered excitedly. "Maybe I can get an even closer shot." The crowd sensed what might happen next. Their attention sharpened. Their expressions changed. The atmosphere grew more tense, not dangerous but serious. Daniel, still unaware, held his phone higher, preparing to lean just a bit closer, thinking he was still safe. He didn't know that this was the moment where everything would begin changing, slowly but clearly, leading to consequences he never expected. Daniel lifted his phone again, holding it high enough to capture both himself and the guard behind him. The excitement in his chest made him forget everything else, the crowd, the rules, and even the respectful atmosphere around Buckingham Palace. All he could think about was getting a perfect moment on video. His heartbeat wasn't fast from fear or worry. It was simply rushing with the thrill of trying something bold. The guard had just shifted his position a moment ago. And that tiny movement replayed in Daniel's mind again and again. He thought about how impressive it looked and how unexpected it felt. Most people would have taken that as a sign to step back and respect the boundary. But Daniel took it as a curious, interesting reaction. He didn't think he was doing anything harmful. To him, this was still just harmless fun, something to show his friends later. He adjusted his hair quickly, smiled at his phone's camera, and began to talk again in a cheerful tone. "Okay, everybody, I think the guard moved. That was amazing. I want to see if I can get another moment like that. Maybe he'll move again. Don't worry, I'm not crossing the line." He turned slightly, checking the line on the ground. His toes were right next to it. Technically, he wasn't crossing it, but he was far closer than before. The tourists around him whispered to each other again. A soft voice from behind him said, "He's getting too close." Another voice added, "I hope he steps back." Daniel heard some of the whispers but didn't pay much attention. He thought they were worried for nothing. After all, he wasn't breaking any rule, at least not in his mind. He took a slow breath and stood tall, almost mimicking the guard's posture again. Then, with exaggerated seriousness, he said into the camera, "Let's see if I can stand like a real royal guard this time." His face tightened, his shoulders stiffened, and he tried to hold a straight pose. But he didn't stay still for even 5 seconds before a giggle slipped out. He quickly covered his mouth and shook his head, laughing at himself. Behind him, the guard continued his calm stance, not reacting to anything Daniel was doing. This level of discipline should have reminded Daniel that the palace grounds were not a place for playful teasing. But Daniel misunderstood it. He interpreted the stillness as permission to continue. He lowered his phone slightly and looked around. More tourists had stopped to watch. Some held cameras. Some crossed their arms quietly. Some looked amused, others uncomfortable. Daniel didn't realize that their attention was not out of admiration. Many of them expected something official to happen soon. One father gently placed his hand on his son's shoulder and whispered, "Never act like that here. These guards are working." His son nodded, watching Daniel with wide eyes. Daniel saw the boy looking at him and waved cheerfully. "Hey, buddy, enjoy your trip," he said with a grin. The boy smiled shyly, but his father gave a polite nod without smiling. Daniel didn't take offense. He simply turned back toward the guard. This time, he held his phone with both hands and stepped back just half an inch to get a wider angle. He breathed out slowly, trying to calm his excitement. Even though he didn't realize it, the air around him was getting heavier with tension. People weren't angry. They were simply waiting for him to understand. Daniel leaned forward slightly, trying to get a better shot of the guard's expression. He wasn't planning to go past the line, but when he leaned, his body moved a bit closer to the boundary. The people closest to him reacted immediately, their eyes widening. One woman said softly, "Oh, no. He shouldn't lean like that." Daniel straightened up again, still smiling, still unaware. He turned the camera toward himself and whispered, "Everyone's watching. Maybe they think I'm doing something cool." He didn't realize that most of them wished he would simply step back. Then something happened. Small, quick, but enough to change the mood completely. The guard shifted again. It wasn't a big movement, just a firm repositioning of his feet and a slight turn of his head as part of his usual duty routine. But because Daniel was so focused on recording, he got startled. He took a tiny step back, gasping softly. The guard wasn't reacting to Daniel personally. He was simply adjusting as a part of his scheduled movement. But Daniel believed the timing was connected to him. He looked at the camera with big eyes and whispered dramatically, "Wow! Did you see that? He moved again!" The crowd behind him exchanged looks. Some shook their heads slowly. Others sighed quietly. A few tourists folded their arms, clearly hoping Daniel would now understand the situation. But Daniel didn't. He felt a curious excitement. He was amazed by how disciplined and focused the guard remained. He respected the guard's skill, but he didn't realize that his own actions were beginning to disturb the respectful mood of the setting. He reviewed the recording for a second and smiled widely. "This is amazing," he whispered to himself. "I want one more shot." He turned his phone back toward the guard once again. A nearby woman wearing a sun hat stepped a little closer and said gently, "Maybe that's enough? You got a good video already." Her voice wasn't harsh at all. It was kind, genuinely kind. She didn't want him to get in trouble, but Daniel misunderstood her tone. He thought she was simply nervous for no reason. "Oh, it's fine," he replied casually. "I'm not doing anything wrong, just recording. I'm being careful." She tried to smile politely but stepped back again, clearly unsure. Daniel focused on his camera again. He held it tightly, stepped right to the edge of the boundary, and leaned in just a little, just enough to make people nearby tense up. Some quietly held their breath, expecting the guard to react again. Daniel wasn't paying attention to any of that. He looked at the screen and said softly, "Okay, this is the last one, I think." He aimed the camera directly at the guard, trying to catch a tiny movement. He didn't plan to disturb anything. He was only curious. Just then, the guard shifted again, another routine movement, calm and controlled. The guard's boots tapped the ground lightly as he adjusted his stance. This time, Daniel reacted differently. Instead of stepping back, he leaned forward quickly, almost as if he was trying to catch the moment before it ended. His motion was fast, unplanned, and surprising to the people closest to him. A soft gasp spread through the small crowd. Daniel froze. His body didn't cross the line, but it was close enough that anyone watching felt uncomfortable. The space between Daniel and the boundary looked too narrow. The guard stood tall and firm, not showing any reaction. And that lack of reaction suddenly made Daniel realize something. He didn't know enough about what he was doing. For the first time since he arrived at the palace, Daniel felt a small tug of uncertainty in his chest. It wasn't fear, but a quiet, confusing feeling, like he had stepped too close to something important without meaning to. He slowly lowered his phone and looked around. Tourists were still watching him, but their expressions were different now. They weren't amused, and they weren't angry. They simply looked concerned. Some had their eyebrows raised. Some pressed their lips together. Some simply looked away, hoping Daniel would understand. The quiet tension made Daniel blink. He didn't like when people looked unhappy around him. His playful attitude softened a bit. He took half a step back from the boundary. He looked at his phone again, the final recording still open on the screen. His voice softened. Maybe that's enough for now. But even though he said that, he still felt curious. His mind began to wander again. He wondered how close he could get without causing a real issue. He wondered if he was truly breaking a rule. He wondered how far he could push his playful experimenting. That little curiosity was still alive inside him. He didn't know that this curiosity, if not controlled, would lead to a moment he didn't see coming, a moment that would change everything for him. And although he didn't realize it yet, that moment was very, very close. Daniel stood still for a moment after lowering his phone, trying to understand why the atmosphere around him suddenly felt heavier. It wasn't that anyone said anything harsh to him. In fact, no one had spoken loudly at all. But the way people were watching him had changed. The playful excitement he had brought with him seemed to fade into something calm, something more serious. Yet Daniel, being the enthusiastic traveler he was, still didn't fully understand the shift. He looked at the guard again, observing the stillness, the discipline, the steady posture. For the first time, he wondered how much patience it took to stand like that for so long. He admired it, but he also felt a soft curiosity tugging at him again. Curiosity had been guiding him all afternoon, sometimes too much. He breathed slowly and checked his phone screen once more. He had enough videos. He had enough photos. He had more than enough for social media. But there was something inside him that wanted one last look, one last moment, one last try at understanding the guard's calm focus. He didn't plan to record this time. He simply wanted to see things with his own eyes. So he took one slow step forward, stopping right behind the marked line on the ground. His foot stayed safely behind it, but he leaned slightly forward to get a clearer view. It was not harmful. It was not rude, but it was close enough to make people around him watch closely. And that was the moment when two nearby police officers noticed him. The officers had been stationed near the palace, calmly observing the tourists and ensuring everything stayed peaceful and organized. They were dressed neatly in their uniforms, wearing gentle but alert expressions. They did not look upset or worried. They simply noticed Daniel's repeated behavior and the growing attention around him. One of the officers, a tall man with kind eyes, nudged his partner slightly and nodded toward Daniel. They both watched for a moment, noticing how close he was to the boundary, how he leaned forward, and how the crowd reacted to him. Daniel didn't see them yet. He was too focused on the guard. He took another small breath as if preparing himself to step back and leave. But before he could move, he heard a quiet voice from behind him. "Sir, excuse me." The voice was calm, polite, and controlled. Daniel turned around and found one of the officers standing a comfortable distance away, his hands held gently in front of him. The officer wasn't rushing or raising his voice. He was simply trying to get Daniel's attention in the kindest way possible. Daniel blinked a few times, a little surprised. "Oh, hello," he said, trying to smile. The officer returned a small, professional smile. "How's your visit going today?" he asked, still using a friendly tone. "Oh, good," Daniel answered quickly. "I'm just taking some videos. The guards look amazing. I didn't mean anything bad." "We understand," the officer replied warmly. "We can see you're enjoying yourself. Buckingham Palace is a wonderful place for visitors." Daniel relaxed a little. The officer's voice was gentle and respectful. There was no anger in it, no heavy warning, just a calm presence. "But," the officer continued kindly, "we've noticed you getting very close to the boundary several times. We just want to remind you to keep a safe distance. The guards are on duty, and this area has certain rules." Daniel nodded immediately. "Oh, I know. I wasn't going to cross it. I was just trying to get a better look." "I believe you," the officer said sincerely. "And thank you for being honest, but sometimes even leaning too close can create confusion. We want to keep everything running smoothly, just for safety and respect." Daniel nodded again, feeling a bit embarrassed but grateful for the officer's tone. "I understand. I'm sorry if I bothered anyone." "You're not in trouble," the officer assured him gently. "We're only asking you to step back a little and avoid any actions that might seem unusual around the guards. They are trained to focus deeply, and giving them space is important." Daniel nodded more confidently this time. "Yes, of course. I'll step back." The officer gave him a kind smile. "Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your visit." Daniel felt relieved. The conversation was calm, respectful, and not scary at all. It made him feel understood rather than criticized. He stepped back a few feet from the boundary, creating a clear and comfortable space between himself and the guards. The tourists around him softened too. Some of them smiled lightly, happy that the situation stayed peaceful. A few nodded at the officers, appreciative of how professionally they handled everything. Daniel tucked his phone into his pocket, deciding it was best to stop recording for now. He looked at the officer again and said, "Thank you for speaking nicely. I didn't realize I was making people uncomfortable." "That's all right," the officer replied kindly. "It happens sometimes. Visitors get excited. We just help guide them so everyone stays safe." Daniel appreciated that explanation more than he expected. It didn't make him feel silly. It made him feel respected. He took a few steps farther back to join the wider crowd. The people near him relaxed. He heard someone whisper, "Good." He stepped back, not in a rude way, but in a relieved tone. Daniel watched the guards one last time from his new position. From farther back, they looked even more impressive. They stood tall, calm, and completely steady. And now, from a respectful distance, Daniel finally saw the dignity in their stillness. He noticed the precision in their uniforms, the careful posture, the way they held their presence like a quiet symbol of responsibility. He realized something in that moment, something simple but important. These guards weren't performers. They weren't here for entertainment. They weren't statues. They were people doing an important job in a place filled with history and respect. Daniel took a deep breath and let that understanding sink in. He stood quietly for a few minutes, letting his excitement settle. He didn't feel embarrassed anymore. Instead, he felt grateful that the officers were kind, grateful that he learned something, and grateful that nothing uncomfortable happened. After a short while, he decided to walk to another part of the palace area. The officers nodded at him politely as he walked away. Daniel waved lightly and gave them a small smile before joining the flow of tourists heading toward the nearby garden. As he walked, he replayed the past few minutes in his mind. He didn't feel upset. He didn't feel scolded. He felt guided, and that made all the difference. He realized that sometimes excitement can make people forget where they are and what's important. And sometimes a gentle reminder is all it takes to understand. Daniel promised himself to be more thoughtful for the rest of his trip. He didn't want to bother anyone or make any visitor feel uneasy. He wanted to enjoy London while also respecting its traditions. From the garden, he turned back and saw the guards standing tall under the soft sunlight. They looked peaceful and focused, just as before. But this time, Daniel watched them with new appreciation instead of playful curiosity. He smiled to himself and said softly, "I guess I pushed my luck a little today." He laughed gently, shaking his head. Little did he know that this experience would stay with him long after he left London. It would be one of those stories he would tell, not with pride, but with a polite reminder of how important respect can be, even when you're just having fun. Daniel walked through the garden slowly, letting the gentle breeze and the peaceful greenery calm his thoughts. He felt lighter now. The excitement that had fueled him earlier had settled into something more thoughtful. It almost felt strange, like he had stepped into a different version of himself. He could still hear the soft murmur of tourists behind him, the distant hum of buses, and the cheerful chatter of families enjoying their afternoon. London felt warm and welcoming again. He found an empty bench near a fountain and sat down, taking a moment to rest. The water behind him made a soft, rhythmic sound as it flowed, almost like it was helping clear his mind. He pulled out his phone but didn't open the camera app. Instead, he just held it in his hands, thinking about everything that had happened. He thought about how excited he had been earlier. How he had seen the royal guards as something interesting, something impressive, something that looked like a fun part of the trip. He didn't think he had done anything wrong at first, because in his mind, he was just having fun, just being playful. But now that he replayed the moments in his head, he understood why people had looked worried. He understood why the officer had walked over to talk to him. He had stepped too close, not physically, but in spirit. He had stepped too close to a place that held meaning, rules, and traditions, and he had done it without realizing how it affected the people around him. A light laugh escaped his lips, not because anything was funny, but because he finally saw everything clearly. "I got carried away," he whispered to himself. He leaned back on the bench and closed his eyes for a moment. The garden was peaceful, full of blooming flowers and old, beautiful trees. The soft rustle of leaves made him feel grounded. After a minute or two, he opened his eyes again and watched a few children feeding pigeons nearby. Their laughter was bright, innocent, and full of joy. He admired how simple their happiness was. That's when something inside him softened even more. He told himself quietly, "Next time, I'll be more careful." After resting a little longer, he stood up and decided to walk toward the palace again, but from a distance this time. He didn't want another recording or another dramatic moment. He just wanted one last look at the guards, this time with a better understanding. As he walked, he stayed behind the large groups of tourists. He moved slowly, observing everything, how people stood quietly, how they smiled softly at the guards, how they pointed out details to their friends respectfully. He realized that most people understood something he hadn't understood at first. Respect doesn't take away fun. It simply makes the experience deeper. Daniel approached a new spot where the guards were visible, but this time he stayed far behind the rope. He folded his arms and watched quietly. The guards' uniform looked even more polished in the afternoon light. Their hats looked taller. Their stance looked stronger. Their silence felt meaningful rather than strange. Daniel smiled softly. There was admiration in his eyes now. As he stood there, a couple from Australia walked up beside him. They were cheerful and relaxed, taking pictures in a polite way. The woman noticed Daniel standing still and smiling. "First time seeing the guards?" she asked kindly. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, they're incredible." "They are," she agreed. "Very professional." Daniel laughed gently. "I learned that today." The couple smiled, not knowing the story behind his words, but sensing his appreciation. After they left, Daniel remained there for another minute or two, taking in the scene with a fresh mind. Then he decided it was time to continue his day. He turned around and began walking along the long path that led away from Buckingham Palace. He felt comfortable walking slowly, enjoying the sunlight and the colorful surroundings. As he walked, he noticed something funny. His mind kept going back to the small moment when the guard moved and surprised him. That tiny moment had felt so important earlier. Now it simply felt like part of the experience. Nothing more. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from his friend back home. "How's London?" He typed back. "Beautiful. Learned something big today." His friend replied, "What happened?" Daniel smiled and shook his head. "I'll tell you when I get home. It's a long story." He didn't want to explain everything over text. He wanted to tell the story properly, not as a dramatic moment, and not as a brag. Instead, he wanted to share it as a lesson he didn't expect to learn on a vacation. As he continued walking, he spotted an ice cream cart on the side of the road. The colorful sign caught his attention, and he felt a spark of joy return. He walked over and bought a vanilla cone. The cold sweetness was refreshing, simple, pleasant. It made everything feel lighter again. He walked toward the lake in St. James's Park and sat near the water, watching ducks swimming peacefully. Children tossed crumbs into the water. Couples walked hand in hand along the path. Joggers passed by with quiet footsteps. It was a perfect afternoon. While eating his ice cream, he thought about the officers again. Their kindness had made a difference. They had spoken calmly, treated him kindly, and explained things without making him feel embarrassed or small. That moment changed the whole experience for him. Instead of remembering this day as something stressful, he would remember it as something meaningful, something that taught him about respect, patience, and understanding. He whispered to himself, "London teaches in quiet ways." After finishing his ice cream, he put the wrapper in a nearby bin and stretched his legs. He felt energized again, ready to explore more of the city. But this time, he would explore with a clearer mind, more aware, more respectful, and more appreciative. He walked along the paths of the park for another hour, taking pictures of flowers, birds, bridges, and trees. His photos felt different now, not rushed or dramatic, just peaceful and thoughtful. He captured moments that felt honest and simple. As the sun began to set, the sky turned soft shades of pink, orange, and purple. Daniel stopped to admire the view. The warm glow reflected beautifully on the water and lit the tops of the trees with a gentle shine. He took out his phone and snapped one last picture. Not of himself, not of the guards, not of a silly moment. Just the sky, just nature, just beauty. Later that night, when he returned to his hotel, he sat on his bed and replayed the earlier videos he had taken. The ones of him acting silly. The ones where he got too close. The ones where he laughed loudly without understanding the setting. He watched them quietly, not judging himself, just observing. Then he slowly selected the videos and moved them into a private folder. He wasn't going to post them. He didn't feel embarrassed, but he felt wiser. Those videos were not something he wanted the world to laugh at. They were something he wanted to learn from, something to remember privately. He leaned back on the pillows and smiled softly. Today was interesting, he said to himself. Unexpected, but good. He turned off his phone, closed his eyes, and let his thoughts drift. The day had begun with excitement and playfulness, continued with surprise and learning, and ended with clarity and calmness. Daniel understood now that sometimes the best stories are not the ones full of excitement, but the ones full of quiet lessons. Lessons that help a person grow, lessons that stay in the heart long after the trip ends. He knew he would never forget the Royal Guards, not because of the videos or the playful moments, but because of the respect he gained. As he fell asleep, he whispered one last soft thought to himself. I came for fun, and left with wisdom.